We're going to talk briefly about GDP, gross domestic product, because you hear about GDP a lot in terms of the perceived economic success of a country, and you hear about it a lot in the context of trade deals, especially free trade deals, when people are concerned that imports into a country could increase. So let's break down GDP a little bit and really understand how it's composed. GDP is composed of all of the consumption that happens within a country, plus all of the investment, plus all of the government spending, plus all of the exports that go out from the country. And then you subtract imports. Now, oftentimes people get a little bit confused by this, and they think that because imports are subtracted in the composition of the GDP, that imports would necessarily shrink a nation's GDP. But nothing could be further from the truth, right? Subtracting imports is simply a balancing mechanism because imports are already counted in the country's consumption. Remember that GDP is consumption, investment, government spending, and exports minus imports, which have already been counted in consumption. So that's why the imports is seen as a minus in the equation, but it doesn't mean that imports shrink a GDP. Imports are therefore zeroed out, right? They're zeroed out to avoid double counting since they already exist in consumption or investment. So when you're thinking about evaluating a trade deal, you need to kind of understand how imports and how they change might affect a country's GDP. So example number one, if there is a new trade deal and the circumstances change so that U.S. exports 1 billion more exports, but they import $3 billion more dollars worth of goods, what happens to the GDP? Well, the GDP goes up by 1 billion, right? Because even though imports increased, they're kind of zeroed out of the equation. So let's say that a country decides to put in tariffs to try to discourage imports, and those tariffs reduce imports by $10 billion. But then other countries retaliate a little bit, and that impacts U.S. exports to the tune of $1 billion. What actually happens there is the GDP goes down by $1 billion. You actually have negative growth. So the important thing to remember about a nation's GDP is that imports don't necessarily have this negative impact that sometimes you hear about in the press. You do want to be concerned if imports start to get substituted for domestically produced goods and services. If that's happening, if that kind of substitution is happening, then the imports might be having a deleterious effect on a nation's economy. But what happens in the United States and what happens across a lot of industrialized countries is imports are used to produce something more complicated that are then in turn exported again. So what you often see is, particularly for the US, against a backdrop of robust GDP growth, you have also seen robust growth of imports. That's your mini lesson on what is GDP and how might it be impacted or not by imports.